Zanab was a young banker in Kumasi who carried the weight of her family on her shoulders. Every morning, she left her tiny office apartment before sunrise, dressed neatly in her modest suits, ready to face another long day at the bank. She worked hard not because she had much, but because she dreamed of one day standing on her own feet. Yet, no matter how hard she tried, it never seemed enough for her parents. At home, she was always reminded of her cousins in America who drove big cars and built houses for their parents. "Look at them," her mother would say. "And look at you. What do you have to show us?" The words cut Zanab deeply, but she stayed quiet, carrying her pain in silence. One evening, when she returned home tired from a long day, she found her parents waiting in the living room. The air was tense. Her father leaned forward and said firmly, "Zanab, it's time you give us $50,000. We want to expand the family business, and as our daughter, this is your duty." Zanab froze. Her heart pounded. $50,000. She barely made enough to cover rent, transport, and food. With a shaky voice, she replied, "Papa, Mama, I don't have that kind of money. I'm just starting my life. Please understand." But instead of understanding, her words were met with cold stares. Her mother's eyes hardened as if Zanab had insulted them. To them, it wasn't poverty speaking, it was rebellion. And in that moment, Zanab felt a storm beginning to rise. The following weekend, the family gathered for dinner. The dining table was filled with steaming dishes of jollof rice, fried plantains, and grilled chicken, but for Zanab, the food felt tasteless. She could sense the tension before anyone even spoke. Her parents sat at the head of the table, their faces stiff, their voices unusually sharp. She knew something was coming. Her father cleared his throat loudly, silencing the chatter. "Everyone here should know," he began, "that Zanab has refused to support this family. We asked her for $50,000, money that would help us expand the business and secure our future. But she turned her back on us." Gasps and whispers moved around the table. Zanab froze, her spoon trembling in her hand. She felt all eyes on her, burning with judgment. Her mother leaned in, her voice rising. "You are selfish, Zanab. After all we did for you, after all the sacrifices, this is how you repay us. You sit in an office every day earning money, but when your family asks for help, you refuse. What kind of daughter are you?" Zanab's throat tightened. She wanted to defend herself, to explain that she barely made enough to survive, but the words caught in her chest. She looked around the table, hoping someone would understand, but all she saw were faces waiting for her to bow her head in shame. Then her younger brother, Malik, smirked. He leaned back in his chair and laughed mockingly. "Ah, see. Told you. Zanab only thinks about herself. She acts holy at the bank, but when it's time to prove her love for this family, she fails. She's not even fit to carry our name." His words stung like fire. Her father banged his fist on the table, making the plates rattle. "Enough of this nonsense," he thundered. "Zanab, you will choose tonight. Either you bring the $50,000, or you leave this house forever. There is no middle ground." The room fell silent, except for the pounding of Zanab's heart. She felt like the walls were closing in on her. Her mother's eyes glared at her, her father's voice rang in her ears, and Malik's mocking smile deepened her wound. Tears burned in her eyes, but she fought them back, refusing to let them see her break. With shaking hands, she placed her spoon down gently. "Papa, Mama, I don't have $50,000, she whispered, her voice cracking. "If that means I must leave, then so be it." The table erupted in murmurs. Some relatives gasped, others shook their heads in disappointment. But Zanab stayed seated, her eyes fixed on her plate, her heart breaking. At that moment, she realized that no matter what she did, her family would never see her as enough. And the choice they forced upon her was no longer just about money. It was about her worth, her dignity, and the life she would now have to face alone. The next morning, the house was heavy with silence. Zanab woke early, her eyes swollen from crying through the night. She hoped maybe her parents would cool down, maybe they would see reason and understand she truly didn't have the money. But as she stepped into the living room, her mother was already waiting, her face hard and unyielding. Her father came out of his room carrying a suitcase. Zanab's suitcase. Her clothes were stuffed inside carelessly, some hanging out from the sides. Her heart sank. "Papa, what are you doing?" she whispered, her voice trembling. He didn't even look at her. He dropped the bag near the door and said coldly, "You made your choice last night. From today, you are no longer our daughter." Zanab's knees weakened, and for a moment she thought she would fall. Her mother crossed her arms, her voice sharp like a knife. "We gave you life, we raised you, we paid for your schooling. And now, when it is time to prove your loyalty, you disgrace us. We cannot keep a child who refuses to honor her parents." Zanab's younger brother Malik stood in the corner, grinning as if he had won a battle. "Good riddance," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for her to hear. Rain had started falling outside, tapping hard against the roof. Her father opened the door, picked up her suitcase, and threw it out onto the wet ground. "Leave this house now," he thundered. "Go and live with the people you choose over us. Since you cannot be a daughter, then you are nothing." Zanab's heart shattered. She stepped slowly toward the door, her legs heavy, her tears mixing with the rain as soon as she crossed the threshold. Neighbors peeked from their windows and verandas, whispering in shock as they saw her parents casting her out. Some shook their heads in disbelief, others pitied her silently, but no one dared to interfere. Standing in the rain, Zanab bent down to lift her soaked suitcase. She looked back one last time, hoping to see a trace of softness in her parents' eyes. But all she met were cold stares and a door slamming shut in her face. The sound echoed like a final verdict. Her clothes clung to her body as the rain poured harder. Her heart felt like it was breaking into pieces, but inside those broken pieces, a quiet strength was rising. She whispered to herself through trembling lips, "They may throw me away, but I will not throw myself away." With her suitcase dragging behind her, Zanab walked down the muddy street, every step heavy yet determined. The neighbors kept watching, but she did not stop. She knew the road ahead would be cruel, lonely, and full of struggle, but she also knew this. Even without her family, she would find a way to stand again. Zanab arrived in Accra with nothing but her small suitcase and a heart full of pain. The city felt bigger, louder, and colder than Kumasi. She had no family to call, no friend to welcome her. After searching for hours, she found a small room to rent in a crowded neighborhood. The walls were cracked, the window barely closed, and the ceiling leaked when it rained. There was only enough space for a narrow bed, a chair, and a tiny table. It wasn't home, but it was all she could afford. At night, when the streets outside grew quiet, her loneliness screamed the loudest. She would lie on her bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying her parents' words over and over. "From today, you are no longer our daughter." The cruelty of that sentence cut into her soul like a wound that refused to heal. Tears would roll down her cheeks until her pillow was soaked, and sometimes she cried herself to sleep, wondering how her own blood could treat her like a stranger. But every morning, Zanab forced herself to rise before dawn. She would put on her neatly pressed clothes, hide her swollen eyes behind a brave smile, and walk to the bank as if nothing was wrong. She worked twice as hard as anyone else, burying her pain in paperwork, numbers, and long hours. Her colleagues noticed her dedication, but none of them knew the storm she carried inside. There were days when hunger whispered in her stomach because after paying rent and transport, she barely had money left for food. Sometimes she ate only bread and water, yet she still pushed herself forward. Each hardship became fuel for her silent vow, "I will survive. I will not be broken." On weekends, when she had no work, the loneliness returned. She would sit by the tiny window of her room, watching children play on the street, families laughing together, neighbors sharing food. It reminded her of what she had lost, but it also reminded her of what she wanted to build for herself, a life where love and dignity existed, even if it meant starting from nothing. In the quiet of those lonely nights, Zanab began talking to herself in whispers, like a prayer. "I am not worthless. I am not weak. I will rise." At first, the words felt empty, but slowly they began to heal her. A quiet strength grew inside her heart, one that no rejection could erase. Zanab had lost her family, her home, and her sense of belonging. But in that tiny room in Accra, she discovered something more powerful than all of it: resilience. She was still broken, yes, but deep inside, a fire had begun to burn, small but steady, waiting for the day it would light her path to a new beginning. One morning, Zanab sat by the small wooden table in her tiny room, sipping a cup of watery tea before leaving for work. The sun had barely risen, and she was already tired. Life in Accra had become a cycle of work, rent, and loneliness. Just as she was about to leave, there was a sudden knock at her door. Surprised, she opened it and saw a well-dressed man holding a leather briefcase. "Are you Miss Zanab?" he asked politely. "Yes," she answered nervously, wondering who he was. He introduced himself as a lawyer from Tamale. "I was sent here on behalf of your late grandmother, Madam Amina," he explained. Hearing her grandmother's name made Zainab's eyes fill with tears instantly. Grandma Amina had always been the one person who treated her with kindness, who never compared her to others, who always reminded her, "You are enough, my child." The lawyer opened his briefcase and carefully handed Zanab an envelope sealed with her grandmother's handwriting. Her hands shook as she tore it open. Inside was a letter written in the familiar shaky script she had known since childhood. "My beloved Zanab," it began. "If you are reading this, it means I am no longer with you. But even if the world turns its back on you, remember I never will. You were always the child of my heart, the one who carried kindness even when life gave you cruelty. What I left behind is yours. Use it well, and let it carry you into the future you deserve." Zanab pressed the letter against her chest as tears streamed down her face. It felt as though her grandmother's arms were wrapped around her again, giving her comfort she hadn't felt in months. For so long, she had felt abandoned by everyone she loved. But here was proof that someone had seen her, loved her, and believed in her worth. The lawyer placed a folder on the table. "Your grandmother left you an inheritance. The details will be explained officially at the family will reading in Tamale. But I wanted you to have this letter first. She wanted you to know she trusted you more than anyone else." Zanab could hardly breathe. The room that once felt dark and suffocating suddenly filled with light. For the first time since being thrown out of her parents' house, she felt a spark of hope. She wiped her tears and smiled through them, whispering, "Grandma, you still believe in me." The lawyer gave her a respectful nod and left. Zanab sat quietly, staring at the letter again and again, reading every line until the words were engraved in her heart. The pain of her parents' rejection was still there, but it no longer felt like the end of her story. Her grandmother's love had built a bridge across her brokenness, leading her toward a future she had never imagined. For the first time in months, Zanab whispered to herself with certainty, "I am not alone anymore. My story is not over." Weeks later, the day came for the official will reading of Grandma Amina. The family gathered in Tamale, at the lawyer's office near the old courthouse. The air was thick with anticipation, and the room buzzed with whispers. Every relative had arrived in their best clothes, smiling and laughing, convinced that Grandma's estate would soon be divided among them. Zanab walked in quietly, wearing a simple dress. Her heart raced as she entered the room. She had not seen most of her relatives since her parents threw her out, and their eyes followed her like daggers. Some cousins whispered under their breath, others rolled their eyes, and her parents didn't even acknowledge her. Her mother leaned toward an aunt and muttered, "She's only here to embarrass herself. She knows she won't get anything." Her father, dressed in his agbada, stood proudly with Malik beside him. Malik laughed loudly, boasting to a group of relatives, "By this evening we will own the farmland, the houses, everything. Zanab will see how useless she is compared to us." His words cut Zanab deeply, but she stayed quiet, clutching her grandmother's letter inside her bag like a shield. The lawyer arrived with a large file in his hands and motioned for everyone to sit. The room grew silent as he prepared to speak. Zanab took a seat in the corner, away from her family, almost as if she were invisible. Even then, her parents avoided looking at her, as though she wasn't their daughter anymore. One uncle leaned forward, whispering loud enough for others to hear, "It's clear the estate will go to her children. That's how it should be." Heads nodded around the table, and smug smiles spread across Zainab's parents' faces. Zainab's mother smiled confidently, adjusting her headscarf. "This is what we've been waiting for. My mother knew her real children, not strays who refuse their duty." The words pierced Zanab's heart, but she pressed her lips together and held her tears. The lawyer cleared his throat, pulling everyone's attention. "We are gathered here today to honor the final wishes of Madame Amina. Before I begin, I must remind you that her will is legally binding and cannot be changed by opinion or pressure." The family nodded eagerly, already imagining the wealth coming their way. Zanab sat quietly, almost ignored, her presence treated like an unwanted shadow. Her father leaned back in his chair, smiling confidently, while Malik tapped his foot impatiently. "Let's get this over with. We already know the outcome," he said arrogantly. But Zainab's heart pounded with a mix of fear and hope. She remembered her grandmother's letter, the words that said, "What I left behind is yours." She didn't know how or when the truth would be revealed, but she held on to that promise like a lifeline. As the lawyer opened the will and began to read, the room fell into complete silence. Everyone waited with bated breath, unaware that their confidence was about to be shattered, and that the girl they had rejected would soon hold the key to everything. The lawyer adjusted his glasses, flipped a page, and began to read in a steady voice. The room leaned in, every relative waiting for their share of the wealth. "According to the wishes of Madame Amina," he said, "her farmland, her houses, and her savings account shall not be divided among the family. Instead," he paused for a moment, letting the silence sink in, "everything will be left to her granddaughter, Zanab." The words hit the room like thunder. For a second no one moved. Then came the gasps, sharp, loud, almost in unison. Mouths dropped open, chairs scraped against the floor, and whispers turned into shouts. Zanab sat frozen in her seat. Her chest rose and fell quickly as the lawyer's words echoed in her mind. "Everything to me." She clutched her grandmother's letter tighter, her eyes stinging with tears. This wasn't just property or money. It was proof that someone believed in her, that someone had seen her worth when everyone else had rejected her. Her parents, however, sat in stunned silence. Her father's proud smile melted from his face. His eyes widened, and for the first time he looked unsure, almost afraid. Her mother's hands trembled as she shook her head. "No, no, this must be a mistake," she muttered. "Read it again. She would never do this." But the lawyer stayed firm. "There is no mistake." Madame Amina was clear. All her assets belonged to Zanab. Malik jumped to his feet, his face red with disbelief. "What nonsense is this? How can she give everything to her? I'm the son, the only son. She can't do this." His voice cracked, and before anyone could calm him, he swayed dramatically and fell back into his chair, fainting. Relatives rushed to his side, fanning him with handkerchiefs, while others shook their heads in disbelief. The hall erupted into chaos. Some whispered, "Grandma knew Zainab's heart." Others muttered angrily, "How could she leave us with nothing?" But all eyes kept turning to Zanab, the girl they had once ignored, the one treated as if she didn't belong. Zanab finally lifted her head. Her tears no longer came from pain but from a mix of shock and relief. For the first time the power in the room shifted. Her parents, who once commanded authority, now looked powerless, trapped by the truth written in black and white. Her father leaned forward, his voice trembling. "Zanab, my daughter, let's talk about this. We can work something out." But Zanab remembered the night he threw her into the rain, saying she was no longer his child. The lawyer closed the file and said firmly, "This decision is final." Madame Amina trusted Zanab to carry her legacy. The room grew quiet again. Zanab sat taller, still overwhelmed, but inside her heart, a fire burned brighter than ever. For once, she was no longer the weak one, no longer the rejected child. She was the one holding the legacy, the one her grandmother had chosen, and nothing could take that away from her. The room that had been filled with pride and confidence only minutes before now exploded into noise. Relatives began talking over one another, their voices sharp, angry, and desperate. Some banged their fists on the table, demanding the lawyer explain again. Others leaned back in disbelief, shaking their heads. One elderly aunt whispered loudly enough for others to hear, "It is because Grandma knew Zainab's heart. She was the only one who visited her in Tamale, the only one who listened when the rest of you were too busy fighting for money. Her words silenced a few, but fueled anger in others. Malik, still being fanned after his dramatic faint, suddenly sat up and shouted, "No! I will not accept this. I am her grandson. I deserve the land, not Zanab. She doesn't even live in Tamale. What does she know about managing anything?" His face was red with rage, his voice almost breaking. Zainab's mother began to cry, her hands reaching toward Zanab. "My daughter, please forgive us. We were wrong. We didn't mean what we said that night. You know we love you. Your father was only angry. We are still your family." Her tears rolled down her cheeks as she tried to touch Zainab's hand. Her father cleared his throat, his pride struggling against his desperation. "Yes, Zanab," he said with a forced smile. "We may have been harsh, but we are your blood. Let us handle this estate together as a family. Share it with us. That is the right thing to do." Zainab's chest tightened as she listened. Memories of the rain-soaked night came rushing back, the sound of her suitcase hitting the ground, her mother's cold words, her father's voice declaring she was no longer their daughter. She saw again the neighbors watching her walk away with tears on her face. That wound was still fresh, still burning inside her. She pulled her hand away gently and said softly but firmly, "The night you threw me out, I begged for love, not money. You gave me neither. You cannot abandon me when I am weak and come to me only when I am strong." Her voice shook with emotion, but her words carried power. The room fell silent. The lawyer cleared his throat, breaking the tension. "Let me be very clear," he said, his tone firm. "This will is final. Madam Amina's decision was legally documented and witnessed. Any attempt to fight it will not only fail, but it will also be against the law." His eyes swept across the room, making sure everyone understood. Some relatives nodded in agreement, whispering, "It is justice." Grandma chose well. Others muttered angrily, but none dared to challenge the lawyer. Zainab sat quietly, her grandmother's letter still in her bag, her heart heavy but steady. She had not asked for revenge, but the truth had spoken for her. The family that once threw her away was now at her feet, begging for what she had been given. And in that moment Zainab knew, the power had shifted forever. After the will reading, Zainab returned to Tamale with a heart full of emotions. She had inherited so much, land, houses, savings. But more than that, she had inherited her grandmother's dream. She remembered the nights she sat in her tiny room in Accra, hungry and alone, and she knew she never wanted anyone else to feel the way she had felt. This wealth was not for her to waste on pride or revenge. It was a chance to build something greater. Her first step was to visit her grandmother's old farmland. The place was overgrown, the soil cracked, the barns falling apart. Yet, as Zainab stood there, she could almost hear her grandmother's voice saying, "This land has life. Treat it well, and it will treat you well." With determination in her eyes, she decided to rebuild it into something powerful. She hired local villagers, farmers who had been struggling without stable income. Together, they cleared the weeds, repaired the barns, and planted new crops. Slowly, the land came alive again. What was once abandoned soil became rows of maize, cassava, and vegetables. She invested in modern farming equipment, trained the workers, and made sure everyone was paid fairly. Soon, her agribusiness was not just feeding her village, but also supplying markets in nearby towns. Word spread quickly. People began to call her Madam Zanab, not out of fear but out of respect. She wasn't the daughter who was thrown away anymore. She was the woman who gave jobs, who lifted others when she herself had once been left to fall. But Zanab didn't stop there. Remembering her grandmother's kindness, she created a scholarship fund in her name, the Amina Legacy Fund. Children from poor families, especially girls, were given the chance to go to school without worrying about fees. Parents wept with gratitude, and students worked hard, inspired by Zainab's story of resilience. She often told them, "Education is the seed that will grow a future bigger than any farm." With each passing year, her projects grew stronger. The farmland expanded, new houses were built for workers, and her scholarship fund sent dozens of students to universities across Ghana. The same villagers who once pitied her now looked at her with pride, calling her a blessing to the community. Her parents and brother, once arrogant, now lived quietly, their voices silenced by the truth. They could only watch from a distance as Zanab rose higher, not with revenge but with compassion. She never went back to seek their approval, because she no longer needed it. Standing at the edge of her grandmother's farmland one evening, watching workers return home with smiles on their faces, Zanab whispered, "This is the legacy you wanted, Grandma. A legacy of love, not greed." Her journey from rejection to respect had not been easy, but it had transformed her into more than just a survivor. She was now a builder of dreams, a woman whose story gave hope to many, and in the heart of her community, her name was no longer spoken with pity, but with honor. The day of the grand launch finally arrived. The once abandoned farmland now stood tall and proud, filled with green fields, modern machines, and workers wearing bright uniforms with the name Amina Agribusiness written on them. Villagers, government officials, and reporters from all over Ghana gathered to witness Zanab's success. Cameras flashed as she walked onto the stage in a simple but elegant dress, her grandmother's old scarf tied around her shoulders. The ribbon was cut, applause filled the air, and soon the journalists crowded around her. One of them asked, "Zanab, after everything you went through, what message do you have for families who betray their own?" She paused for a moment, her eyes soft but steady. Then with a gentle smile she said, "Blood rejected me, but love found me in Grandma's hands. They tried to erase me, but she wrote me back into destiny." The crowd went silent, her words sinking deep into everyone's hearts. Then came a wave of cheers, clapping and tears. Cameras captured the moment, and within hours, the clip spread across Africa. People on social media shared it with captions like, "This is the power of grace," and "Zanab speaks for all of us who were once rejected." Young people found hope in her story, parents told their children about her strength, and communities began to talk about kindness, inheritance, and the value of standing strong against betrayal. As Zanab looked over the farmland, she knew this was more than her victory. It was a message for everyone who had been cast aside. Her grandmother had given her more than wealth, she had given her a voice that now echoed across a continent. And that voice could not be silenced.